In the course where I review environmental problems, I have a playlist or two on water. And this video is just going to provide kind of an overview of these videos. And obviously, these videos go into many of these concepts in greater detail. First, it could be argued that water is the world's most important molecule. Certainly, it's the most common molecule in my body. But also on the planet, when you look at the percentage of the Earth which is covered by water. Despite that, despite its enormous abundance, it is scarce, at least for many of the uses which humans would like to employ water for. So much of it is salt water, and therefore not useful for drinking or for crops or for agriculture, etc. There are areas where there are glaciers, permanent stores of water since the last ice age for thousands of years. And so of the amount of water, only a tiny fraction of it is available. Now, it obviously cycles in that water evaporates from the surface of plants, known as transpiration. It evaporates from oceans and lakes, etc. It then forms clouds, and these clouds can accumulate more and more water vapor until water falls as rain once again, and the cycle continues. And so that is important. Later, I'll mention, thoughts on how climate change might be impacting water. One of the first issues which then presents itself is the scarcity of water. And like many environmental problems are affect certain parts of the country, certain parts of the world more than others. And so I live in the Northeast United States, and this is an odd topic, for my students, because it rains a lot. And actually, the Northeast of the United States, our areas get far more precipitation than the majority of people on planet Earth experience. And so water scarcity, it seems odd that that's, as big a problem as it is. But about 700 million people in 43 countries experience water scarcity. This not only affects how much we need to drink, but when you just think about the other things that water is used for. So, for example, a kilogram of rice, 2.2 pounds, requires a couple thousand of liters of water to produce. A kilogram of beef requires over 10,000 liters of water to produce. And so therefore, if you live in an area where water is scarce, then clearly that is a limit potentially on the number of people who can live there, the number of crops which can be grown there, the amount of livestock which can be held as well. Now, in the middle of the United States, there is not a great body of water whose evaporation is providing abundant rainfall. While the Pacific Ocean would potentially serve this function, the Rocky Mountains block most of the clouds. So California gets far more rainfall than Kansas and Oklahoma, etc. While the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico could potentially provide this. The way that winds blow brings this rain to the Northeast rather here. And so therefore, the question comes up, well, in the middle of the country, where do people find water? And the answer is, well, there's a huge aquifer which is underground called the Ogallala aquifer. It's one of the world's largest aquifers, covering over 170,000 square miles, and it's under a number of states, including portions of these states here. It's very important. More than 2 million people rely on it for drinking water, but also the crops grown in this area, the livestock often depend on the water being pumped from here. The depth of the aquifer varies. So at its southern edge, maybe a couple of feet in depth, whereas more than 1,000 feet towards the north. How far down do you have to dig to reach the aquifer? Well, maybe 100 feet in the south, maybe 400 feet in the north. And so here's just an illustration. So if you were to drive, say, along Kansas or along eastern Colorado or many places of the Midwest, you might find areas like this where it looks certainly very dry and arid. But that every now and then you'll come across green patches where there's a patch where a lot of crop is being grown. And if you ask, well, what's happening there? And the answer is that here there is a pump which is pumping water from the Ogallala aquifer in order to irrigate this cropland and support plants that would not otherwise be able to grow, which is wonderful. The problem is, however, water is being extracted from the Ogallala aquifer faster than it is returning from the scant rainwater that the area gets. Obviously, like many resources, water, when it is scarce, can be overused. So the Ogallala aquifer is shrinking. Certain areas where it used to extend, it is no longer there anymore. Other areas where it is, the wells which extract water from the Ogallala aquifer have to be about 100 feet deeper than they used to be because the level in the aquifer is dropping. And so then there are legal issues. So who has rights on pumping water out? How much can be pumped out, etc.? If there's a question of a pipeline going through, if the pipeline were to leak, while the pipeline obviously would be an economic boon to the area, if it were to contaminate this Ogallala aquifer, which is such a huge resource for the region, would the cost of an accident far exceed whatever benefit the pipeline is providing? And so there are, depending on what region you live in, water scarcity and all of the issues surrounding it are clearly important. Clearly being irrigated. This then also affects rivers in arid areas. So, for example, the Colorado River. What I'm about to say, is true of the Colorado River. But for example, I lived in Paraguay for 2 years while I was in the Peace Corps, and on the essentially it was used to irrigate cropland, etc. And so many areas it was just it had become dry. So as I talk about the Colorado River in the Western United States, certainly this affects rivers in South America, in the Middle East, which is very arid. The rivers there. So these concepts are important in many regions of the world. So the Colorado River is this wonderful river which is providing water for more than 30 million people. It irrigates cropland, millions of acres. It attracts visitors, for outdoor education, for whether it be hiking or tubing and rafting, etc. Now, like many things, it is variable. That water cycle varies, and its average flow is 15 million acre feet, but this can vary considerably. Now, the fact that it varies then is a problem, because in an arid area, there are many individuals who would like more water if possible. So if you could pump more water out, then you could now plant a different crop or plant more crops or have more livestock if you can support them with water, or have more buildings, and towns. And so the question is, well, how much water can you pump? And once again, here we get into legal issues. And so there was a 1922 Colorado River Compact, which stated each of these states gets this much water. All right. And so it is legally then prescribed, this state can pump out this water, but no more. The problem then is that the amounts of water which legally a state can pump out can exceed the volume of the Colorado River. So the Colorado River could legally then have more water leaving it than is coming into it in a given year. And then if there is a drought year, and with climate change, not only are droughts, a phenomenon which occurs from time to time, with climate change, they're becoming more frequent, more prolonged, more serious. So then if this resource then is dropping, well, then what happens? Who gets the water? Who has to cut? And so now you can see a scenario where farmers in this region are being pitted against the people who want to raise livestock in this other region versus towns which would like water for in a third region, etc. And so this is also as I mentioned, change. Not only is there more snowfall, the spring floods, they can be so our case more aspects. Well, what can one do with one's land? Can you have horses where you need so much water? Can you plant, certain plants? Well, once again, this is very often determined by laws. And so this example, which I'll go into more detail in this video if you choose to watch, is based on a real Colorado. Let's say there are 3 neighbors all along in the town. All right, their property touching their does not have water. So the water is there, but they're water as it was, which some of which can go back on years. Water is highly coveted. So number 2, senior and number 3 is a water use number 2. And then there are other scenarios which could play out. Let's say it's a dry year, there's a drought, and everyone is asked to conserve water. Well, this neighbor could be responsible and use less water. But then this neighbor could then say, this neighbor is not using as much, all of their water. And so therefore they should, forfeit some of their water rights. I should get them, so they could take them to court. So this person in a drought year wasn't, say, watering their lawn to reduce their water usage, but this neighbor could then take advantage of that and get some more of their water rights. And if this neighbor then didn't want to use it for, say, more horses, this neighbor could, say, sell the or lease the water rights to, say, a developer. Let's say someone wanted to do hydraulic fracturing downstream. And so this neighbor could say, I'm going to lease you some of my water rights so you downstream can use some of my water. And so it's very complicated in specific areas. And once again, the example I'm using was, was based on, an actual example of some place I stayed. Other places have issues of water scarcity that you might not think. So for example, let's say you went to an island, say in the Caribbean. Well, it's an island, water's everywhere, correct? No, it isn't. Because, certainly there's salt water all around, but, these houses, they need water for drinking, washing clothes, etc. Where do they get it? Well, if it's a large enough island, there might be a small, what's called fresh groundwater lens underneath. So if you dug down deep enough that you could actually hit a thin layer of water which could be pumped. Small islands might not have this at all, and if you hit water, it might just be salt water. So say, in certain states, you could just dig a well and fresh water comes out, but islands actually might not have that as a possibility. Rising sea levels, severe weather can actually then cause salt water to intrude on this. So even if you depend um, on fresh water and you're used to getting it after a severe storm or sea levels rise with climate change, then water may become in short supply. And so you'll notice on a lot of these islands, they're in the ocean surrounded by water, but we see, a lot of more arid plants, cacti and palms, which use less water. Many in some areas, all of the buildings, most of the buildings have what are called cisterns, which collect rainwater. So if you ask, well, how much being collected into which is then for drinking or for cooking. So just a mention that islands are all, you don't necessarily think of water scarcity with islands in the middle of the ocean, but yet nevertheless, it can be. Another example of water scarcity would be what plants can be grown. Once again, so you can see here, there's these patches of green corn in the middle of Midwest. Now, here you can see that pulling what I call aquaculture, genetically modified, using less water in an area becomes important. There are mobs with less with for water in the northeast United States. If you want to plant plants outside your house, plant a tree, or have a lawn that you water, whatever, you can. But you'd then be surprised if you were to go, say, in the Southwest and you say, oh, I want to plant a maple tree. They look pretty. You can't. All right. It's against the town ordinances to plant a type of plant which would need so much water to maintain. You would be fined. So you are not allowed to plant any plant that you want, and then just water it. And so, you would be restricted in what plants you could use. So that is another issue. Water scarcity affects many people. I gave you some examples. In the United States, all of these would then be issues which would face individuals living in other countries as well. A couple of other issues. One is salt, and this also ties in a little bit to water availability. The salts in the ocean got there from fresh water, all right? Now, fresh water doesn't have much salt in it, but as all of the rivers of the world empty into the ocean and bring their salts, the water in the ocean evaporates and then falls as rain, but the salts stay behind, and then over time, they became concentrated. So that's where the salt of the ocean came from. And then if one irrigates land, then the same thing happens. So if you continually pump water out, say over cropland, as it evaporates, salt will form. So here's, vast areas in Paraguay. After time builds up, then the soil can become saltier and then no longer fit for agriculture. And so areas which are very hot and irrigated, such as the southwest of the United States, some parts of South America, the Middle East would be a classic example of this. Historically, we know that crops were grown in certain regions, but now crops can't be grown because of how salty the soil is. As more and more water is used, not only can rivers get smaller and smaller, but if one were to look at lakes in areas that have been drained for irrigation, one can see that there can be a steady decrease in the size of the lakes, like Lake Arid in Asia, which was one of the largest inland bodies of water, but this applies to many areas. So the shoreline recedes, many species of fish then die, and there are industries like fishing industries, which for long expansive time have depended on the presence of this lake. Well, as the surface area of the lake gets smaller and smaller, clearly that is no longer possible. And so another thing which goes hand in hand is as water sources are exploited faster than they can be replenished, as soil becomes saltier, then areas can become more desert. Now, also going hand in hand with this is if areas keep livestock to a greater area and then should. So for example, let's say there's a vegetation holding down the little soil that an arid area has. If too much livestock is kept, then the livestock can eat that vegetation. Wind can now erode the soil, and after losing the nutrients in the topsoil, the remaining soil can't really support much in the way of plant life, etc. And so desert spreads. And so this is affecting many parts of the world, that not only are there arid regions and desert, many semi-arid regions are becoming arid, many arid regions are becoming desert. And so thus, as the human population grows and grows, a problem is, as deserts spread, the amount of land which can support human habitation is decreasing. All right. So those are some issues. Obviously, climate change will make desertification worse. Another issue which affects water is that of eutrophication. That literally means to be well nourished. So here you can see that there are clearly algae in this body of water, and algae are important. They're the basis of the food chain. The little fish are eating the algae, they're providing oxygen, etc. So, algae, good. Up to a point, all right? Because if there's too much algae and too much bacterial growth, then what can happen is that while they are producing oxygen, the algae, they also use oxygen. Algae sometimes at night, but they use oxygen as they produce oxygen as they make sugar, but then they intend on using their sugar, so they use oxygen to use it. And then there are bacteria which don't perform photosynthesis. So if there's too much of these microbial populations, they can actually use so much of the oxygen that now there's no oxygen left for the fish. And so while for food chains, you need certain levels of microbes. If you encourage growth of too much, in the way of microbes, then there's no oxygen and you have a dead zone, all right, where you just can't find any fish. And there are dead zones which are forming because when we use fertilizers on land, this washes into bodies of water. If septic systems are emptying into bodies of water, this provides nutrients for blooms of microbes, bacteria, algae. They can now greatly increase their population because there's now more nutrients for them to grow. The nitrates and phosphates, for example, which they were in short supply of, now they can grow, but now that means there's less oxygen, and so a lot of lakes. But then even for example, when the Mississippi River empties into the Gulf, the area of the Gulf that can then be fished, or that you can find a shrimp in, or the area of Chesapeake Bay where you can fish and get harvest aquatic life, is getting smaller because of this eutrophication, because of the fertilizers, the detergents, the septic, which is emptying into these bodies of water. You're encouraging growth of microbes, which will then limit the growth of fish. There are plenty of other issues which involve water. One, which, teaching in the Northeast United States doesn't impact most of my students as directly, but certainly very serious, so I bring this up, and that is disease. So when we think of sanitation, Many people think of a toilet, that looks like this, but most people in the world don't have a toilet indoors which looks like this. So in some, it's a slab, on the ground, say a concrete slab with a hole over a pit. Perhaps there's some structure over it, and perhaps there isn't. All three of these. So I think many of my students, for example, might say this is normal and this is more primitive, but we would perhaps include all of this as improved sanitation. So this, and this. And if you ask what percentage of the world's population has access to improved sanitation, if we were to depict 7 people here for the 7 billion people who live on the planet, only about 4/7, slightly over half, would have access to one of these. 2 billion people are without improved sanitation, and more than 1 billion people would practice open defecation. And so the situation which we find sanitation, many students might say, my experience is kind of normal, not realizing that there are billions of people on the planet who do not have access to your level of sanitation. And so therefore, when we consider, well, are there diseases which are spread through unclean water? The answer is yes. So, over 1 million people die per year of diarrhea, mostly children. There are then deaths from malnutrition, which involves water usage, because if you're getting parasites in with the water, then that decreases the nutrients available for you. There can be nematode worms spread through water. Many of the larvae of these nematodes rely on water, so that, like people say, working in a rice paddy might have these larvae burrowing in through their skin. And so sanitation issues affecting water are huge. Now, when I was in the Peace Corps in the town of Saint-Denis in the 90s, I had a well and a latrine, as is typical throughout the world. I'll show you in a second, and it's fallen a little bit into decay since I was there. But nevertheless, this is normal. So many of my students will look at this and it seems atypical to them. But once again, this is normal. And I had, a Giardia, which I actually got closer to the capital and kept for the better part of 2 years. That was the latrine that I used. Obviously, it's in disrepair. But notice how close that is to the well. When I lived in Paraguay, there was an outbreak of cholera in Peru, and we were very worried that it would reach Paraguay as well, because on the hill, someone at the top of the cholera, that meant that from the trains, they were coming down that hill, and it only reached me all say 30 to 2 hours. At the bottom of it, when it was really wet at this time, the water level was actually at ground level. Now, if you know anything about wells, that's really bad. You want your well to be deep, because the deeper it is, it's filtering water. If the water in your well is very close to the surface, then that means there's very little filtration potentially happening. And so once again, if cholera had reached us, it could have very easily spread. And so as the number of people who are affected by diarrhea and parasitic worms and microbes like Giardia throughout the world, it's in the billions. So the ability of water to protect against that, with improved sanitation, et cetera, that is an issue. Now, many countries then wrestle with, well, then, how do we promote, say, the growth of, economic growth, which is obviously very important with all of these. And so, for example, countries like China, which have done an amazing job, at least from my, reading and understanding, I think it's not debated that China has lifted more people from poverty in recent decades than has ever been done in any country in history. And so, to be credited for the enormous improvements that they have brought to human life. But still, when I last checked, there were many areas where personal sewage wasn't treated, and so therefore could reach water more easily in many areas than it should. That there are entire cities that lack sewage treatment plants. Once again, as far as this then increases the potential for disease to spread. Other issues which affect water involve mercury. So mercury isn't common. One of the places where you can find it is in coal. Now, it's not that abundant in coal. Its concentration can vary a bit, and so I think I have two examples here of just, if you compare coal, from this part of the world to that part of the world. So here it's 0.24 parts per million, there it's 0.07 parts per million. So you can see, it's varying by more than a factor of 3, but in any case, it's not that common. The problem is we burn a lot of it, all right, billions of tons. So then you can have something which isn't that common, but if you're burning billions of tons of it, right, so if it's coal to a large extent, which is providing the electricity for cities, that's an enormous amount of coal that you need to burn to generate this amount of electricity. So now that's an enormous amount of mercury that you're putting into the air. Now, mercury in and of itself is not, absolutely, horrible to a large extent. But the problem is that chemical reactions occur in life. Bacteria can promote some of these. And so that mercury can then be converted into a more dangerous form of methyl mercury, which I'll get to. And so there are tons of mercury which are released into the atmosphere per year. And one of the issues is, like, even if you were to say, well, not much of that is occurring in my region of the world, it doesn't matter because the winds blow this. So for example, the Arctic is certainly getting mercury pollution, but not because they're burning coal in the Arctic, but because it's coming from North America, Europe, and from Asia. A lot of the mercury pollution which is reaching California is not from North America, but instead from Asia. And so even if this isn't something that your area is producing, nevertheless, the area where you live could be affected by that. Here's a methyl group, CH3, carbon and 3 hydrogens. If you attach that to mercury, then you have what's called methyl mercury, and that is toxic. And so when mercury is added to the environment, it gets worse. And now you might say that, all right, so yes, it's worse, but it's not that common, all right? And at first you're correct. So if you were to measure the amount of mercury in a pond, for example, there's not a lot of mercury there, even if there is some. And so it's not a whole lot in the pond. However, once living things take it into themselves, it gets stuck. All right, so it stays in these living, these organic molecules and in living tissues. And so if you were to measure how much methyl mercury there is in, say, bacteria and microbes, well, here's a little animal that's eating the bacteria. Here's a large paramecium, which is eating the microbes. So it now, because methyl mercury will stay, those organisms then have a higher level of methyl mercury than the bacteria in the waterway. And then if you have insects which are eating those paramecia or the rotifers, etc., now the insects will get all of their mercury and more if these little fish are eating, those little animals or insect larvae. Once again, it stays. And so what you're seeing is, as we go up the food chain, the amount of mercury in the tissues of living things is going up. All right, so there's more a greater percentage of mercury in these fish than there were in what the fish were eating. Now, these are little fish. So the big fish, which then prey on the little fish, will then get their mercury, and it will accumulate in the tissues of the larger fish. And then when you look at the apex predators, so this could be large predatory fish in the ocean like sharks. On land, it could be things like herons, great blue herons, bald eagles, and then humans ourselves. Because mercury has become more and more concentrated as we've gone up the food chain. And then it's those things at the tops of the food chains which are the greatest, which are at the greatest risk. Humans, we have a lot to worry about with methyl mercury. One of the main things is that it affects the development of nervous systems. Here I'm just going through. Some fish are more likely to accumulate methyl mercury depending on how they feed. This would include, say, bottom feeders like catfish. And so there are warnings in many waterways throughout the United States. You can't eat fish from this waterway, or maybe you can't eat this kind of fish in this waterway because of mercury pollution. Or if you're a pregnant woman or breastfeeding, you're asked not to eat mercury or fish from this waterway. Or people are recommended, please no more than one fish per month from this waterway, etc. And once again, one of the reasons, especially for children, women who are pregnant, etc., is it affects the development of the nervous system. As we ask, why is the frequency of autism increasing? One of the leading candidates is a greater exposure to methyl mercury, and many pregnant women are asked to avoid eating fish products or eating, tuna, etc., because women who are pregnant would then increase the amount of mercury that the developing fetus's nervous system would be exposed to. Another issue affecting waterways is flooding. Now, flooding is, has always been an issue, but with climate change increasing the frequency of severe storms, it can be more and more of an issue. But also, one of the buffers against flooding is wetlands such as swamps and bogs. So swamps and bogs are places where water accumulates, and it can sit for a while. So after a heavy rain, it will swell, the shoreline, stretches, but this water does not immediately make its way into, say, a river. But when we build, housing developments, I mean, the flat land of a swamp, is often an ideal site, to pave over and to put, houses there. But then water is drained so that it can reach, say, rivers and streams more quickly, meaning that after a severe storm, the water levels are more likely to jump up precipitously. And so one of the things is, as there are more and more people taking up more and more land, we drain more and more wetlands, which means that we're losing this buffer which protects us from floods. So floods will become more and more common and causing more and more damage, both because of climate change, but then also because of our draining of wetlands for human use. And it was these wetlands which offered, a buffer against flooding. Here I have a video on coral reefs, but I have another playlist just on coral reefs, which I'd like to get to at the end. Climate change is a concern for many reasons. One of the reasons is that as sea level rises, not only do islands have to fear for saltwater intrusion, but also cities do. So cities, I'm sorry, I think I just skipped one. Cities such as, for example, Miami on the coast use a lot of fresh water. But as sea level rises, there can be saltwater intrusion of freshwater aquifers and water sources, so that now fresh water will become more and more scarce. And then just all of these other issues which involve water. So, for example, nuclear power relies on water. Now, if we are trying to mitigate climate change, nuclear power does not release carbon dioxide, as does the burning of coal or natural gas or petroleum. So, in that sense, you could make the argument that nuclear power, is a better protector of the environment than the fossil fuel burning. But one of the problems is that climate change is threatening nuclear power. There have been days where nuclear power plants have had to shut down because water may become more scarce, as climate change means less and less rainfall, more and more drought. Or, and this has happened, where in the summer, the water is just too warm, that as global temperature climbs, this means that the temperature of the water is climbing. And this could then mean that the nuclear power plant can't find water of the appropriate temperature to cool down, turbines to the degree before, so it has to shut down and stop energy production. We can get to energy again later, but one of the sources of electricity, which is replacing coal, is hydraulic fracturing's production of natural gas. Natural gas production has a number of potential effects on water. And the data which is that I'm deriving this is from the EPA's 2015 report, Hydraulic Fracturing for Oil and Gas. And just a quick statement: if you were to say, well, let's look at more data, well, obviously that's great. But this was the first comprehensive report. And so, because the spread of natural gas is a relatively recent phenomenon, long-term studies, they simply aren't available. They will be. So all of this information from the EPA was the attempt to give a comprehensive look at hydraulic fracturing. Now, one of the things that was found is, if you were going to say, well, how does this, say, affect water availability? One of the things that you may notice is, if you ask a typical well, say in Utah, how much water will it use? 0.3 million gallons. How much water might a typical well in West Virginia use? 5 million gallons. And so one of the things that this EPA report did was, rather than have this idea that the effects of hydraulic fracturing are X, it's important to realize that hydraulic fracturing can vary as it is practiced from one part of the world, or the world actually, to another. And so if you were to ask, well, how much water is used? Well, clearly, as you can see on this map, it varies per well. Now, if an area has only a few wells and if water is abundant, this may be a relatively minor or not a major impact. But if an area has a larger number of wells, and if water is scarcer in that area, then it could be a much greater effect on the community. And so there's this issue with water. Once again, all of these videos go into these in a little bit more detail. Taking then a couple of the subsequent steps, there is chemical mixing, which will occur at the drilling site. So here you see that surface water is then mixed. All right. And then I go through how that is done. And then there is then the potential then for some spills to then cause the contamination of water. So what are the effects of these spills? This would then vary because how big is the spill? How close is it to groundwater? what response is there, and so the effect on groundwater supplies could be, from small to serious. What chemicals are being spilled? Well, there can be very harmful chemicals used in this, but each drilling site could then use different chemicals. So it's not as if this is, a universal federal endeavor. So this company could be using chemicals different from the company operating the neighboring well. Some chemicals are not supported. Some states and some areas have very lax regulations where companies do not have to report the chemicals that are being used. From a company's point of view, that might even be a selfish, a desire in that, for example, if there's a spill, if, the regulators in the area don't know what chemicals are being used, they don't know which chemicals to test for as evidence of a spill. A company could say, this is, my trade secret. I don't want other, companies to know. And reporting is often voluntary. And so if, one is concerned what water, might, what chemicals might enter into water that, that might not be known. And so then in later steps of hydraulic fracturing, water is injected into the well, all right? And then one might ask, how might this affect water quality here for, say, the drinking water? Well, the first answer is it shouldn't, because where the water is going and the targeted rock formation is so deep that you could argue, well, this will have absolutely no effect on this these resources. The problem is, however, wells vary, so this space between the well and the drinking water resource, that can vary. And then also as going up there, you might say in an ideal scenario, there would be no risk to drinking water, but leaks in casing or tubes, that could then change that. And there have been cases with leaks in casing and tubes. Some companies, perhaps because, in earlier days or in states where regulations are lax, don't use cement around the tubes, or spaces between the casing and the cement, or cracks in the cement, depending on the quality, etc. And so you could say, ideally, water from here should not contaminate the drinking water there, but it can. And there are a number of scenarios, given there, and going into greater detail in the video and in the report, that could then result in that. Now, there's then what's in the water that comes out then has, contaminants from that deep, water, which, are things that one doesn't want, to be exposed to drinking water. So what does one do? Well, that now has water from the formation and has the chemicals which were added, and then new chemicals from the chemical reactions, from, which, have produced all these new things. Well, that varies, all right, because there are different ways of disposing of this water, some safer than others. In some states, for example, in Pennsylvania here, it was once the practice that one could then, you could just spread that on roads. All right, so you take all of this water with many contaminants, man, you can just spread it on a road and it'll dry up, etc. That is no longer the practice in Pennsylvania. But it is the practice in other states where you can just dump it anywhere, and so obviously this would be then the worst way of disposing of the wastewater and all of these chemicals. So if you were to ask what are the effects of storing this waste water, it varies. And so this report, once again, the most comprehensive report on the effects of hydraulic fracturing at the time, goes through, there's not one practice. It's not done by one company in one state. And so therefore, if one were asking what are the effects on, say, water pollution, at one well, it could be minimal. And another well, it could be serious, contaminating water sources. There are certainly many more issues which affect water, of which I'd like to introduce just a couple more. One is certainly oil spills. So, there's some oil lost, uh, just through regular, maintenance of, ships and transport of oil, et cetera. But then there are, oil spills, and there have been a number, which have, closed beaches, affected whole industries, such as those who fish and shrimp, affecting wildlife, etc. So, the loss of oil is certainly very serious. As pointed out, very many areas, if you're near a stream, you can find an advisory like you shouldn't eat fish from these areas, like from here to there, or because of mercury poisoning, or you should limit your fish to this many per month unless you're pregnant or a child, in which case you shouldn't have any fish at all. When I had mentioned that certain areas like the Aral Sea are continuing to decrease, then there are photos of ships from fisheries which where the ships are no longer able to access the sea, etc. A couple of other thoughts: if you were to look at, say, the number of fish, there are great fisheries throughout the oceans where a great number of fish have been caught. All of them are either at maximum or have collapsed. And so if you were to look at the cod fisheries off the northeast United States, obviously Cape Cod was named after a fish because of the enormous number of cod which could be caught and the importance. Well, they can be overfished. The numbers can crash and then cannot necessarily recover from that. And so even though there have been moratoriums in the United States and Canada on fishing in an attempt to restore these fisheries, the levels have not reached what they once were. And so many areas depend on fishing for not only for livelihood, but then also fish is a major source of protein, and especially certain parts of the world like Southeast Asia, it can be a primary source of animal protein. And whole fisheries can be overfished. Certain animals such as sharks can be overfished and pushed to into decline or extinction. So for example, the practice of serving shark fin soup often means that shark were harvested unsustainably, their fins were cut off, and the rest of the carcass was simply thrown back into the ocean. And so overfishing is a serious problem, whether it be for the decline of fish as a source of protein or individual species. When it comes to many fish migrate, such as the shad, where they will spend part of their life in freshwater and then part of their life in the ocean. So the young may then migrate downstream and then live out much of their ocean, then come back upstream to mate and to breed again. But this then means that these fish now depend on aquatic habitats in the freshwater, along the route to the ocean, in the ocean, etc. So they can be affected by a number of things. And although this looks horrible that the fish are dying, this is actually natural in that a lot of the fish at the very end of their life cycle, they come up into fresh water, they breed, and then they die. So this is not necessarily the sign of a problem. And the bald eagles, which are thriving, at this, in the Delaware, they count on the shad, making the shad run every year to sustain them. But there are things that humans can do which affect this, such as the building of a dam. So if you build dams on rivers, that could then prevent fish from then being able to migrate upstream. And so then species might now be limited, no longer able to inhabit the freshwater sources that they once did. Other problems is that invasive species can be spread, right? Especially as, ships, transport material, including ballast water, often from one part of the world to another, or if boats don't wash themselves, or don't get washed, so that they aren't as spreading any things that might uh, adhere to the boats. So this could then spread things like the sea lamprey. Now, lampreys are native to the Atlantic Ocean and to many areas of, say, New York State, and many waterways such as the Hudson and the Delaware. But they were introduced into the Great Lakes as a canal was built that went around Niagara Falls. And so thus they could now parasitize the fish of the Great Lakes, where, given that each lamprey can then be responsible for the loss of 40 pounds of fish, have caused an incredible reduction in the number of fish which can be taken out of the Great Lakes. Here's a female lamprey with all of the eggs producing or more, and even caused the extinction of some species. And so this was one other aspect that humans have helped the transport invasive species. So invasive species is an issue in the. Then finally, I just want to mention this. This is such an important topic that I have a separate playlist just on this, is the importance of coral reefs. So coral reefs are not that abundant. If you were to take all of the coral reefs of the world, it would equal, say, about the size of the states of New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. Now, given the 3/4 of the Earth's surface covered by corals, covered by ocean, that's not a big area. But nevertheless, corals are incredibly important for both people and for wildlife. For people, many islands and coastline are old coral reefs. Was once coral reefs, so it's important there. The coral reefs around the shoreline help against storms, wave action, and the damage done by is linked to coral reefs. Coral reefs and the radiation that they provide, making money. Then many other realize, wait, if the area has sharks, many people pay from fishing these. And so incredibly for a number of industries. But coral reefs provide food. Some fish eat the coral directly. It provides habitat, it provides protection from young. And so the most diverse areas of ocean life are the coral reefs. As I had said, coral reefs aren't that big, making up maybe an area the size of, Pennsylvania. And here I'm just comparing, say here, the same way that trees and forests give a three-dimensional habitat for life on land, that coral reefs are doing. And so notice the three-dimensional structure here. And so just as enormous is not only essential for marine life, because about a quarter of all fish in the ocean will spend at least part of their life cycle in coral reef. Here you can fish eating young to be in near corals, etc. Nowhere else in the ocean do you find as much diversity. Just as young terrestrial animals need a secure place like a den to develop, the same too would be true in a coral reef, where you can see all the little fish maturing here. So coral reefs are incredibly important both for marine life and for humans. The tragedy is that humans are affecting in so many different ways. Overfishing is affecting the life of the coral reef because as we take out more and more fish, this then lets algae and many invertebrates develop, which then grow on top of the reef, limiting the sunlight that the corals can get, so they can die. Climate change is warming the ocean waters, which It means that corals are threatened. Many bleach. They lose their biology and this from the fuel that becomes plastic, which then inhibits the carbon from the corals, so that it can inhibit their growth there. As sea levels rise, this will mean that the corals in their present site will not get as much sunlight, and this will inhibit them. In many places in the world, the fishing techniques include the using of dynamite or poisons, or dragging nets along the bottom by big commercial fishing operations. And so therefore, humans are doing countless negative effects on incredibly. Unfortunately, one of the greatest effects on coral, or one of, I'm sorry, the next video is just, I put together a little song on this, if that's of interest as well. Coral reefs are the most important marine habitat in oceans, but nevertheless, human activity is severely affecting coral reefs, and many areas are bleaching. And so this is one of the most significant problems in oceans. This video is meant to provide environmental issues which affect water and on our planet. And as I'd said in these playlists,